I should have died when they dragged me through the portal into their realm. But instead, I found myself staring at the most beautiful predator in the known galaxy. And that's when I realized she was smiling. The Shadowhaven Tribunal stretched before me like a cathedral built from starlight and nightmares. Rows upon rows of Cretan judges lined the obsidian amphitheater, their azure skin shimmering beneath the ethereal blue radiance that poured from crystalline formations embedded in the domed ceiling. The air itself seemed alive, charged with an energy that made my human nervous system spark and dance in ways evolution had never intended. But it was her I couldn't stop staring at. She stood at the center of it all, draped in robes that seemed woven from the void between stars. Her hair cascaded in waves of midnight blue, each strand catching the ambient light like captured lightning. When she moved, which she did with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, the fabric whispered against itself with sounds that reminded me of solar wind through asteroid fields. This was High Adjudicator Lythra, and according to every briefing I'd received, she was supposed to be the galaxy's most feared judicial executioner. My name is Jasper. 6 months ago, I was nobody, a maintenance engineer on Terra Station's water reclamation level, the kind of human the galaxy forgot existed. Now, I stood accused of the most impossible crime in Cretan law, thinking thoughts that could kill. The irony wasn't lost on me. We humans had spent 3 centuries convinced we were alone in the universe, and when we finally made contact, it turned out our greatest weapon was the one thing we'd never thought to weaponize, our imagination. The Cretan had ruled the galactic core for 10,000 years through pure psychic dominance. Their minds were vast networks of shared consciousness, each individual a node in a greater tapestry of thought. They experienced reality as a collective dream, beautiful and serene and utterly, perfectly ordered. Then they met us. Human thoughts, it turned out, were chaos incarnate. We dreamed in paradoxes, believed in impossibilities, and our minds generated what the Cretan termed cognitive dissonance bombs. Thoughts so contradictory and wild that they could crash entire sectors of their mental networks. A human imagining something absurd, like a square circle or a married bachelor, could trigger psychic seizures in any Cretan within a 100-meter radius. We were walking weapons of mass imagination. Lythra began to speak, and her voice carried harmonics that resonated in my bones. The Cretan language was music made manifest, each word a symphony that painted emotions directly onto my consciousness. Through the translation nanites in my bloodstream, her meaning became clear. "Jasper Kane of Terra Station," she said, and my surname echoed through the chamber like a death knell. "You stand accused of the deliberate projection of chaotic thought forms into the collective consciousness of the Kithen Mining Collective, resulting in the temporary incapacitation of 47 individuals and the permanent mental scarring of 3 others. How do you answer these charges?" I tried to speak, but my throat had gone desert dry. The weight of 1,000 alien stares pressed down on me like the gravity of a neutron star. Every Cretan in that chamber was connected to every other through invisible threads of thought, and I was the discordant note threatening to shatter their symphony. I started, then stopped. "How do you explain that you weren't trying to hurt anyone, that you were just daydreaming about home while fixing a water pump? How do you tell a species of telepathic perfectionists that humans don't control their thoughts the way they control breathing?" I didn't know, I finally managed. I didn't know I could do that. A ripple of what felt like amusement passed through the assembled judges, but Lythra's expression remained neutral. She descended from her elevated platform with movements that defied gravity, her feet barely seeming to touch the steps. "Ignorance is not a defense in matters of psychic terrorism," she said, stopping just close enough that I could smell her, ozone and starflowers, and something indefinably alien. "The Cretan Code is clear. Any being capable of projecting chaotic thought forms must be either contained or eliminated. The word eliminated hung in the air like a blade. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of curiosity, interest. The Kraten were supposed to be emotionally homogeneous, their feelings as synchronized as their thoughts. Yet this one seemed to be wrestling with something privately, something the collective hadn't approved. However, she continued, and now I was certain I heard something different in her voice. There is a precedent for alternative sentencing in cases involving species of unique cognitive architecture. She began to circle me, and I found myself tracking her movement like prey watching a predator. Every step brought with it a wash of sensation, the whisper of fabric, the subtle shift in air pressure, the way the chamber's lighting seemed to bend around her form. "Tell me, Jasper Kane," she said, "what were you thinking about when the incident occurred?" "Home," I answered honestly. "I was thinking about Earth, about," I hesitated, then pushed forward, "about rain." Another ripple through the crowd, stronger this time. The Kraten homeworld was a planet of eternal twilight, where weather was precisely controlled and rain was a concept they had to access through archived memories. "Describe it," Lithra commanded, stopping directly in front of me. I closed my eyes, and despite every instinct screaming at me not to think, I let the memory surface. "It's chaos," I said, and felt the collective flinch. "It falls when it wants to, not when you schedule it. Sometimes it's gentle, like whispers against your skin. Sometimes it's violent, like the sky is screaming. You can smell it coming hours before it arrives, this green, electric smell that makes every animal restless." I opened my eyes and found Lithra staring at me with an intensity that made my nerve endings spark. "And you find this pleasant?" she asked. "I find it alive," I said. "Random, unpredictable, beautiful because you never know what it's going to do next." The silence that followed was deafening. I had just described everything the Kraten had spent millennia trying to eliminate from their existence. Chaos, unpredictability, the terror and beauty of the unknown. But Lithra was still smiling. "High Adjudicator," one of the judges called out, his mental voice cutting through the chamber like a laser. "The defendant has confessed to willful cultivation of chaotic thought patterns. The code demands immediate termination." "The code," she replied without breaking eye contact with me, "also grants me discretionary authority in matters involving unprecedented circumstances." She turned to address the assembly, and when she spoke, her voice carried new harmonics, deeper, more complex, tinged with something that sounded almost like defiance. "For 10,000 years, we have maintained order through the elimination of chaos. We have achieved perfect unity, perfect predictability, perfect stagnation." The last word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of unease throughout the collective. When did we last create something new? When did we last feel surprise? When did we last dream of something that didn't already exist in our shared memory? A low hum of distress began to build in the chamber as hundreds of minds tried to process what their High Adjudicator was saying. "This human," she continued, gesturing toward me, "possesses something we have lost, something we may have never had. His mind generates possibilities we could never conceive, dreams we could never dream. Yes, it causes disruption. Yes, it challenges our order, but perhaps that is exactly what we need." "High Adjudicator," the protest came from a dozen minds simultaneously. "You speak of heresy. The collective has voted. The Chaos Bringer must be eliminated." "The collective," Lithra said, and now her voice carried harmonics I'd never heard before, dangerous harmonics, frequencies that seemed to cut through the shared consciousness like a sword through silk, "has grown complacent." What happened next violated every piece of intelligence the Terran Federation had gathered about Kraten society. High Adjudicator Lithra, one of the most powerful telepathic entities in known space, deliberately severed her connection to the collective. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A A psychic scream tore through the chamber as 1,000 minds suddenly found themselves cut off from their anchor point. Judges collapsed in their seats, clutching their heads. The harmonic resonance that had filled the air dissolved into discord and chaos. And in the center of it all, Lythra stood alone, truly alone for perhaps the first time in her existence, her mental isolation complete. "Now," she said, and her voice was different now, still musical, but wild, untamed, uniquely her own. "Now I understand what you meant about rain." The chamber erupted into pandemonium. Some judges tried to forcibly reconnect with their severed high adjudicator, their psychic tendrils reaching out like desperate fingers. Others fled entirely, unable to cope with the sudden absence of collective thought. A few, and this was the most terrifying development of all, began to laugh. Lythra grabbed my hand, and the contact sent lightning through my nervous system. Her skin was cooler than human normal. But beneath that surface chill, I could feel something burning, a fire that had been dormant for millennia and was only now beginning to ignite. "Can you show me more?" she asked, and her eyes were wild with something that might have been hunger. "Can you show me what it's like to think thoughts that have never been thought?" I stared at her, this ancient, beautiful, terrible being who had just destroyed everything she'd ever known for the sake of experiencing something new, and realized that humanity's first contact with alien intelligence had just become something far more complex than anyone could have predicted. "Yes," I said and squeezed her hand. "But fair warning, it's going to get messy." She laughed, and the sound was like nothing the Creighton had ever produced, pure, chaotic, perfectly imperfect human joy echoing through their sacred chamber. "Good," she said. "I've had enough of perfection." Around us, the Shadowhaven Tribunal continued its descent into beautiful chaos as more and more judges began to experience something they'd never felt before: curiosity about the unknown. Some fought it, clinging to their collective consciousness like drowning swimmers to debris. Others embraced it, severing their own connections and taking their first, terrifying steps into individual thought. But not all of the Creighton were ready for evolution. The chamber's great doors burst open with a sound like thunder, and through them poured the Harmony Guard, the Creighton military's elite psychic enforcers, their minds so rigidly synchronized that they could maintain collective consciousness even in the presence of chaos-generating humans. Their leader was a being I recognized from intelligence briefings: Warsinger Kethvas, a creature so thoroughly integrated with the collective that some xenobiologists questioned whether he still qualified as an individual entity. His skin gleamed like polished obsidian, and the bioluminescent patterns across his skull pulsed in perfect synchronization with his squad. "High Adjudicator Lythra," he sang, and his voice carried harmonics of absolute authority. "You will submit to psychic rehabilitation immediately. The Chaosbringer will be terminated as ordered." Lythra stepped in front of me, and I could feel the heat radiating from her body as whatever transformation she was undergoing continued to accelerate. "I am no longer your high adjudicator," she said. "I am something new, something the collective cannot control." "Then you will be eliminated along with the human," Kethvas replied, and raised his weapon, a crystalline construct that hummed with contained psychic energy. That's when I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I laughed. The sound cut through the chamber's chaos like a bell, clear and bright and utterly human. Every eye turned to me, human engineer Jasper Kane, nobody from nowhere, standing in the heart of the galaxy's most powerful civilization and finding the situation hilarious. "You want to know the funny thing," I said, addressing the Warsinger directly. "You're so afraid of chaos that you've become completely predictable. Your entire species follows the same patterns, thinks the same thoughts, makes the same choices. You're not a civilization, you're a computer program." And like any program, I grinned and began to think the most chaotic thought I could manage. I imagined a color that didn't exist, not just a new shade, but an entirely new primary color that would fit between blue and green without being turquoise. I pictured it in my mind with perfect clarity, gave it weight and texture and emotional resonance, and then projected that impossible concept with every ounce of mental energy I possessed. The effect was immediate and devastating. Every harmony guard in the chamber staggered as their synchronized minds tried to process a logical impossibility. Their perfectly ordered thoughts collided with my imaginary color and shattered like glass against steel. Kethvas himself went rigid, his bioluminescent patterns flickering like a malfunctioning display as his brain attempted to categorize something that couldn't exist. A thin line of silver fluid, Cretan blood, trickled from his left nostril. Like any program, I continued, walking toward the paralyzed war singer, you have bugs, and humans, we're walking bug reports. But even as I spoke, I could feel the strain. Maintaining an impossible thought took everything I had, and I could sense my mental defenses beginning to crack. Whatever psychic abilities allowed me to disrupt Cretan consciousness came with a cost, and I was rapidly approaching my limit. That's when Lythra surprised me again. She reached out with her newly individualized mind and somehow amplified me. I felt her consciousness merge with mine, not in the controlling way of the collective, but as a partner, a collaborator. Together, we took my impossible color and made it more impossible, adding dimensions of impossibility I could never have conceived alone. The result was psychic annihilation for every connected Cretan in the chamber. The Harmony Guard collapsed like puppets with severed strings. Even some of the judges who had been trying to resist the call of individual thought were overwhelmed, their collective connections severed by the sheer force of our shared impossibility. In the sudden silence, Lythra and I stood together in the center of the ruined tribunal, surrounded by the unconscious forms of the galaxy's former masters. That, she said, and I could hear amazement in her voice, was the most beautiful thing I have ever experienced. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw that her transformation was complete. The bioluminescent patterns that marked all Cretan had changed, becoming something new, something individual. Instead of the standardized neural pathways that connected her species to their collective, she now bore markings that were uniquely her own, swirling galaxies of light that pulsed with the rhythm of her individual thoughts. What happens now? I asked. She smiled, and the expression was no longer the perfectly calculated Cretan smile I'd seen before. This was something wilder, more dangerous, more alive. Now, she said, we find out what happens when an ancient civilization learns to dream. The sound of distant alarms began to echo through the chamber as word of the incident spread through the collective. Soon, this place would be crawling with Harmony Guards, Thought Shepherds, and every other variety of psychic enforcer the Cretan could muster. But I found I wasn't afraid. They'll come for us, I said. Yes, she agreed. And when they do, they'll find something they've never faced before, two minds that can think impossible thoughts together. She took my hand again, and this time the contact felt different. Not the alien electricity of before, but something warmer, more familiar, more human. Can you show me more about rain? She asked. I want to understand what it feels like to be surprised by the sky. Around us, some of the judges were beginning to stir, their minds slowly rebooting after the psychic assault. A few looked confused, disoriented by their sudden disconnection from the collective. But others, and this was the truly revolutionary development, looked curious. They wanted to know what they had missed. I can show you rain, I said to Lythra, but I'll have to show you Earth too, the whole chaotic, beautiful, impossible mess of it. Is it very far? She asked. 3 months by standard hyperdrive, I replied, but I'm guessing the Cretan have faster ships. Her smile turned predatory in the most delightful way. The fastest in the galaxy. They'll never expect their own high adjudicator to steal one. Former high adjudicator, I corrected. Former everything, she agreed. I am something entirely new now, something that has never existed before. The sound of the alarms was getting closer, and I could hear the harmonic synchronization songs of approaching harmony guards echoing through the corridors. "Time to go," I said. But as we turned to leave, one of the stirring judges called out to us. It was an elderly Cretan whose bioluminescent patterns had begun to shift and change, breaking away from their collective uniformity. "High Adjudicator," he said, then caught himself. "Forgive me, I do not know what to call you now." "Lythra," she replied simply. "Just Lythra." "Lythra," he repeated, testing the name as an individual designation rather than a title. "When you reach this Earth place, will you tell them about us? About what happened here?" I exchanged a look with my unlikely partner. "What would you want us to tell them?" The judge struggled for words, his newly individual mind grappling with concepts the collective had never allowed him to consider. "Tell them," he finally said, "that some of us want to learn how to dream." More judges were stirring now, and I could see the same struggle playing out across dozens of faces as minds that had been synchronized for millennia tried to discover what it meant to think unique thoughts. "We will," Lythra promised. "And perhaps some of you will find your own way to the stars." The sound of marching feet echoed from the corridors, the heavy, synchronized tread of harmony guards advancing in perfect formation. We had perhaps minutes before this chamber would be flooded with psychic enforcers. "The shuttle bays are this way," Lythra said, moving toward a hidden passage I hadn't noticed before. "But they'll have the entire facility locked down within minutes." "Then we'd better move fast," I said, and followed her into the shadows. As we ran through the darkened corridors of the Shadowhaven Tribunal, I found myself thinking about the impossible color we had created together. That beautiful, nonsensical thing that had no name and couldn't exist, but somehow did anyway. It struck me that in many ways, we were like that color now. Two minds that had found a way to be more than the sum of their parts, something new and impossible, and utterly unprecedented. Behind us, I could hear the war singer Kethvas beginning to recover, his voice rising in harmonic commands as he rallied his remaining forces. The Cretan would not give up their perfect order without a fight, but ahead of us lay the stars, and beyond them, a blue-green world where rain fell when it pleased, and chaos was just another name for freedom. "Lythra," I said as we reached the shuttle bay access codes. She was entering into the security panel. "Yes, when we get to Earth, when you feel your first real rainstorm. What do you think you'll discover about yourself?" Her fingers paused over the controls, and for a moment her expression was pure wonder. "I don't know," she said, and then laughed with pure joy. "Isn't that wonderful? I don't know." The doors hissed open, revealing a sleek Cretan scout ship humming with contained energy. As alarms blared throughout the facility and the sound of pursuing guards grew louder, we stepped aboard humanity's strangest diplomatic mission. I was nobody, a maintenance engineer from the water reclamation level. But as our stolen ship lifted off into the star-scattered void, carrying the galaxy's most dangerous thoughts toward a small blue world where impossible things happened every day, I realized that sometimes being nobody was exactly the qualification you needed to change everything. The last thing I saw as we escaped the Shadowhaven Tribunal was a cluster of judges' faces pressed against the chamber's great windows, their newly individual bioluminescent patterns flickering with something that might have been hope. The galaxy was about to learn what humans had always known, that the most beautiful things in existence were the ones that should have been impossible. And as for Lythra and me, we were flying toward rain, toward chaos, toward a world where love stories could bloom between species that had nothing in common except the desire to surprise each other. It was going to be messy. It was going to be wonderful. It was going to be perfectly, beautifully human. Humans might survive space, but can you survive leaving a comment?